expect this court to believe that.
In the gleaming halls of Westfield University's law school, Maria Rodriguez moves quietly through corridors lined with portraits of distinguished alumni, all white, all male, all staring down with centuries of privilege. The morning light filters through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows on marble floors that have witnessed decades of legal education. The air carries the scent of old books and fresh coffee from the faculty lounge, mixed with the nervous energy of students rushing to their next class. No one knows that Maria carries a briefcase containing documents that could expose the university's decades-long pattern of discrimination. No one even notices the 28-year-old custodial worker who arrived before dawn, who cleans the very offices where admissions decisions are made, who overhears conversations that weren't meant for her ears. But when Dean Patterson and his senior faculty struggle with mounting pressure from civil rights organizations demanding transparency in their admissions process, she observes from behind her cleaning cart. She watches as they huddle in emergency meetings, their voices tense with worry, their confident facades cracking under scrutiny they've never faced before. "We need to make this go away," Dean Patterson's voice carries through the thin conference room door as Maria polishes the nameplate outside. "These allegations of bias in our admissions process are threatening our federal funding." Professor Williams nods grimly, shuffling through papers. "The statistics are damning. We've admitted only 12 Latino students in the past 5 years out of over 3,000 applications. The numbers don't lie." Maria's hand freezes on the brass nameplate. Those weren't just statistics. They were lives, dreams, futures. Denied. She'd seen the rejection letters in the trash bins, watched promising young minds dismissed with form letters that spoke of fierce competition and limited spaces. What they didn't know was that Maria Rodriguez wasn't just any custodial worker. She wasn't just someone they could ignore, invisible in their ivory tower world. Behind those tired eyes and worn uniform was a Harvard Law graduate who'd walked away from a promising career at a prestigious firm to care for her dying mother. She was someone who understood their legal jargon better than they realized, who recognized the discrimination patterns they thought were carefully hidden. And with just one phone call to the right civil rights attorney, armed with the evidence she'd been quietly documenting for months, she was about to turn their comfortable world upside down. She was about to prove that sometimes the most powerful voice for justice comes from the most unexpected place. Because sometimes the person you overlook, the one you treat as invisible, is the very one who sees everything. And Maria had been watching, listening, and waiting for the right moment to act. Today, as she heard them dismiss the concerns of an entire community as merely bad optics, that moment had finally arrived. The sound of her cartwheels on marble echoed through the hallway as she continued her rounds, but inside her chest, her heart was pounding with the rhythm of change about to come. They had no idea that the woman emptying their trash cans was about to empty their secrets into the light of day. The irony wasn't lost on her. They'd trained her well in the law, and now she was about to use every lesson they'd taught her against the system that had failed so many. In her bag, alongside cleaning supplies and lunch, lay copies of internal memos, recorded conversations, and a detailed analysis of admissions data spanning 10 years. Evidence that would prove what the Latino community had known all along, that Westfield University's doors were closed to them not by lack of qualification, but by design. Maria smiled quietly to herself as she pushed her cart toward the next office. Sometimes justice wears a uniform they don't expect, speaks with an accent they dismiss, and comes from hands they think are only good for cleaning up their mess. But today, those same hands were about to clean house in an entirely different way. Before we continue with Maria's incredible story of courage and justice, I want to ask you something important. Stories like these need to be heard, shared, and remembered. If this resonates with you, please hit that subscribe button, because every week we bring you real stories of people who refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice. Rate this story from 0 to 10 in the comments. How much did Maria's courage inspire you? And here's what I really want to know. Have you ever witnessed discrimination that others tried to hide? Have you ever been underestimated because of who you are or where you work? Your stories matter too, and I read every single comment. Now, let's see how Maria's quiet revolution was about to shake the very foundations of one of the most prestigious law schools in the country. Maria Elena Rodriguez had worked in the custodial department at Westfield University for 18 months, arriving each morning at 5 a.m. when the campus was still shrouded in darkness and silence. Her routine was precise, methodical. Empty trash bins in the administrative offices, dust the conference tables where futures were decided, mop the floors where dreams either took flight or were crushed under the weight of institutional indifference. The professors and administrators walked by her as if she were part of the furniture, their conversations continuing unfiltered in her presence. To them, she was just another faceless worker in a blue uniform, someone whose existence only mattered when the trash overflowed or the floors needed attention. They spoke freely about admissions quotas, discussed problematic applications from minority students, and laughed about keeping their standards high. Code words Maria recognized all too well. But Maria watched. She always watched. And she listened with the trained ear of someone who had once sat in those same conference rooms, not as a cleaner, but as a participant in the very system she now observed from the shadows. On that particular Tuesday morning, Maria heard something that made her blood run cold and her hands tremble as she sorted recyclables in Dean Patterson's office. "We need to be more careful about our Latino admits," Dean Patterson was saying to his admissions committee. "The board is concerned about maintaining our school's culture." Professor Williams leaned forward conspiratorially. "I've been flagging applications with Spanish surnames for additional review. Most don't make it past the first round." Maria moved closer to the door, her heart pounding. Those words weren't foreign to her. She'd heard similar language used in corporate boardrooms, in faculty meetings at other institutions, in the polite, coded conversations of people who believed their prejudices were justified by tradition. She whispered under her breath, "That's systematic discrimination. That's a clear Title VI violation." Professor Williams caught the sound and turned, seeing Maria with her cleaning cart. He smiled with practiced condescension. "Everything all right there? Don't mind us. Just discussing some boring administrative stuff you wouldn't understand." But deep inside Maria, something had stirred. Not just anger. She'd felt that before. Not just frustration. That was a daily companion. This was something different. This was the awakening of a lawyer who had been dormant too long, buried under grief and necessity, but never truly gone. That evening, in her small apartment near the campus, Maria sat at her kitchen table with a box she hadn't opened in 2 years. Inside lay her Harvard Law diploma, still in its original frame, the gold seal gleaming under the fluorescent light. Beside it, her old case files from her previous life at Morrison, Klein and Associates, where she'd specialized in civil rights law before her mother's cancer diagnosis changed everything. She traced the embossed letters of her degree with a finger that now bore calluses from industrial cleaning chemicals. Once, this diploma had been her ticket to a corner office, to respect, to a voice that people listened to when she spoke. Now, it seemed like evidence from another life, a reminder of who she used to be before duty and love required her to become invisible. Maria remembered the day she'd walked away from the law. Her mother, Isabel, had been given 6 months to live. No insurance, no family except Maria, no one else to navigate the complex medical system or simply hold her hand during chemotherapy session. The choice had been clear, even if it meant sacrificing everything she'd worked for. "Mija," her mother had whispered during one of their last conversations, "promise me you won't let them make you small forever. Your voice is too important to stay quiet." Isabel Rodriguez had never finished high school, but she'd cleaned office buildings for 30 years, working double shifts to send her daughter to college. She'd seen the discrimination, felt the sting of being overlooked and undervalued, but she'd believed her daughter would be different, that Maria would have a seat at the table, a voice that mattered. Now, sitting in her apartment, with evidence of systematic discrimination, literally in her trash bags from work, Maria realized her mother's words had been prophetic. She hadn't lost her voice. She'd just been gathering the evidence to use it more effectively. The last time she'd touched these legal documents, she'd been arguing a housing discrimination case before a federal judge. She'd won that case, securing fair housing rights for dozens of families. The victory had been sweet, the recognition satisfying, but it paled in comparison to what she was contemplating now. But this time, Maria didn't cry for her lost career or her mother's absence. She didn't mourn the path not taken. Instead, she turned to her laptop and started typing, her fingers remembering the rhythm of legal briefs, her mind sharpening with the familiar challenge of building an airtight case. "There it is," she whispered to the empty apartment, her mother's rosary hanging on the wall, seeming to nod in approval. "It was always there. The lawyer in me never left. She was just waiting for the right case. And this case, this fight for justice, for recognition, for the dreams of students who looked like her, this was exactly what she'd been training for her entire life." 3 days later, the emergency faculty meeting still lingered in Dean Patterson's conference room, voices growing sharper as federal investigators announced their intention to audit Westfield's admissions practices. The investigation had been triggered by a formal complaint filed with the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, a complaint so detailed, so legally sophisticated, that it had immediately caught federal attention. "Someone's feeding information to these civil rights attorneys," Professor Williams said, pacing nervously. "The complaint contains internal data that shouldn't be accessible to outsiders. Enrollment statistics by ethnicity, records of admissions committee discussions, even quotes from our closed-door meetings." Dean Patterson loosened his tie, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "We need damage control. Our federal funding is at stake. We're talking about $40 million annually. If they prove systematic discrimination," Maria entered quietly to empty the trash, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She'd been timing these meetings perfectly, arriving when emotions ran highest and guards were down. Today's cleaning cart held more than supplies. Hidden beneath the bin liner was a digital recorder, small enough to remain undetected. Without thinking, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You might want to review your Title VI compliance protocols. The federal reviewers will examine 10 years of data, not just recent admissions." Dead silence. 7 pairs of eyes turned to her with expressions ranging from surprise to indignation. Here was a custodial worker, someone they paid to be invisible, offering legal advice about federal civil rights law. "Excuse me?" Dean Patterson's voice carried the sharp edge of authority challenged. "I don't think anyone asked for your input on university policy," Professor Williams scoffed, his laugh bitter and condescending. "Maria, isn't it? I think you should focus on cleaning and leave the legal analysis to people with actual law degrees." The other committee members shifted uncomfortably, some embarrassed by the open dismissal, others nodding in agreement. To them, Maria's suggestion wasn't just inappropriate. It was a fundamental violation of the hierarchy they depended on to maintain their sense of superiority. Maria walked away, her cart, wheels squeaking against the polished floor. But this time, something fundamental had shifted inside her. That wasn't just embarrassment burning in her chest. That wasn't just the familiar sting of being dismissed because of her uniform, her accent, her presumed lack of education. That was righteous anger finally waking up. In the supply closet, Maria pulled out her phone and dialed a number she'd memorized but never thought she'd use. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Rodriguez and Associates Civil Rights Law. This is Elena Rodriguez." "Elena, it's Maria, your cousin. I think it's time we had that conversation about the case I mentioned." Elena Rodriguez had graduated from Stanford Law 2 years after Maria finished at Harvard. While Maria had been caring for their Aunt Isabel, Elena had been building a reputation as one of the Southwest's most aggressive civil rights attorneys. She'd been waiting for Maria's call for months. "Tell me you have evidence," Elena said without preamble. "I have 18 months of recorded conversations, internal memos, statistical analysis, and documented patterns of discrimination that would make your head spin," Maria replied. "Elena, they're not just rejecting qualified Latino students, they're systematically excluding them using coded language and artificial barriers." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. "Maria, are you telling me you've been conducting an undercover investigation while working as custodial staff? Do you understand what you've just described?" Maria took a deep breath, feeling pieces of her old identity clicking back into place. "I'm describing a federal civil rights violation under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, systematic exclusion based on national origin and ethnicity, using institutional policies that create disparate impact. This isn't just discrimination, it's a conspiracy to maintain educational segregation." "My God," Elena whispered. "Maria, this could be the case that changes everything, not just for Westfield, but for universities across the country. Are you ready for what comes next?" Through the supply closet's small window, Maria could see the law school's main building, its brick facade gleaming in the afternoon sun. Somewhere in those halls, another generation of Latino students was being turned away, their applications dismissed before they even had a chance to prove their worth. She thought about her mother, about the dreams that had died in those sterile admissions offices, about her own journey from Harvard Law to a custodial closet. But mostly, she thought about the students who would come after her, the ones who deserved the same opportunities that had been given to generations of privileged white students. "Elena, I've been ready for this fight my entire life. I just didn't know I'd be fighting it from a janitor's closet with a law degree hidden in my locker." Then it's time to remind them that justice doesn't care what uniform you're wearing when you serve it. As Maria hung up the phone, she could hear the faculty meeting resuming in the conference room. Their voices carried through the walls, confident, dismissive, certain that their secret was safe. They had no idea that their most dangerous opponent had been emptying their trash cans and listening to every word. The irony was perfect. They'd spent so much time looking down on her that they'd never thought to look up at what she was capable of achieving. In her modest one-bedroom apartment that evening, Maria sat cross-legged on her living room floor, surrounded by boxes she hadn't opened since moving from Boston 2 years ago. The largest box contained the remnants of her former life: legal briefs, case files, newspaper clippings from her victories at Morrison, Klein & Associates, and photographs from her Harvard Law graduation. On the coffee table before her lay her mother's worn Bible, bookmarked with holy cards and pressed flowers. Beside it, her law school diploma gleamed under the apartment's soft lighting. The contrast wasn't lost on her. The dreams of an immigrant woman who cleaned offices and the achievement of a daughter who had made those dreams reality only. To find herself cleaning offices once again, Maria opened a manila folder labeled Rodriguez Vir Metropolitan Housing Authority, her first major civil rights victory. The case had taken 3 years to build, fighting against a housing authority that systematically denied rental assistance to Latino families. She'd been 26 then, fresh out of a prestigious law firm, hungry to make a difference. The newspaper photograph showed a younger Maria standing on courthouse steps, surrounded by grateful families who could finally afford decent housing for their children. "Legal Eagle soars for housing rights," read the headline. She remembered that day vividly. The satisfaction of victory, the knowledge that her work had changed lives, the certainty that this was her calling. But destiny had other plans. Back then, civil rights law was her language. She'd spoken fluently about disparate impact theory, about institutional discrimination patterns, about the subtle ways systems maintained inequality while appearing neutral. She'd argued before federal judges, negotiated with government agencies, and built cases that seemed impossible to win. The last major case she'd handled before leaving Boston involved a university, ironically enough, Northeastern Technical. Institute had been systematically rejecting qualified minority applicants for their engineering program while accepting less qualified white students. Maria had spent 14 months building that case, analyzing admission data, interviewing rejected students, and documenting the school's discriminatory practices. She'd won a settlement that changed the entire admissions process and secured admission for 17 students who had been wrongfully denied. The victory had earned her national recognition and a partnership track at one of Boston's most prestigious civil rights firms. 3 days after that victory, her mother called with the diagnosis that changed everything. "Mija, the cancer is in my lungs, my liver. The doctor says maybe 6 months." Isabel's voice had been steady, matter of fact, but Maria could hear the fear underneath. The choice should have been agonizing. Give up everything she'd worked for. The career, the recognition, the chance to fight injustice on a grand scale, to become a caregiver for a woman who had already sacrificed so much. But for Maria, there was no choice at all. Isabel Rodriguez had come to America at 17, speaking no English, carrying nothing but hope and an unshakable belief that education could transform her daughter's life. She'd worked 3 jobs to pay for Maria's college, attended every graduation despite having to take unpaid time off work, and never once complained about the sacrifices required to give her daughter opportunities she'd never had. "When you needed me most, I was there," Maria had told her mother. "Now it's my turn." The 6 months became 18 beautiful, heartbreaking months. Maria moved back home, found part-time legal work that allowed flexible hours, and spent every possible moment with the woman who had shaped her sense of justice. Isabel's stories during those long days became Maria's education in a different kind of law, the unwritten laws of dignity, respect, and moral courage. "You know what I learned cleaning those office buildings for 30 years?" Isabel had said during one of their last conversations. "Rich people think their secrets are safe because they think we're invisible. But invisible doesn't mean blind, Mija. We see everything." When Isabel died, Maria felt as though she'd lost not just her mother, but her compass. The law that had once inspired her seemed hollow in the face of such personal loss. She couldn't return to Boston, couldn't pretend that corporate clients and billable hours mattered when the person who had given her purpose was gone. So she'd come to Albuquerque, taking the first job that offered health insurance and anonymity. Custodial work at Westfield University wasn't a career choice. It was grief management, a way to disappear while she figured out how to live without her mother's guidance. But this time, as she looked through the evidence she'd been gathering, the recordings, the memos, the patterns of discrimination that mirrored her old cases, Maria didn't cry for her lost career or her mother's absence. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years: clarity. Her mother's final words echoed in her mind. "Promise me you won't let them make you small forever. Your voice is too important to stay quiet." "There it is," she whispered to her mother's photograph. "It was always there. The fight never left me. I just needed to find the right battlefield." And this battlefield? Fighting for students who looked like her, whose dreams were being dismissed by people who couldn't see past their prejudices. This was exactly what Isabel Rodriguez had prepared her daughter to fight. The Westfield University campus was still wrapped in pre-dawn darkness when Maria stepped out of her aging Honda Civic, her breath visible in the cold October air. She'd spent the weekend preparing for this moment, reviewing federal civil rights statutes, organizing her evidence, and mapping out exactly how she would execute what she privately called Operation Transparency. She entered the administrative building through the staff entrance, her keycard granting access to areas where secrets were stored and futures were decided. The hallways were silent except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of early morning traffic beginning to build outside. No hesitation. Maria walked directly to the admissions office, past portraits of distinguished alumni, whose faces seemed to watch her progress with curiosity. Her first stop was Dean Patterson's office, where she knew the most damaging evidence was stored. Using her universal custodial access, she photographed internal memos that explicitly discussed limiting Latino admissions, recorded meeting notes that used coded language about maintaining standards, and documented email chains that revealed the systematic nature of the discrimination. In Professor Williams's office, she found the smoking gun, a spreadsheet tracking applicants by surname ethnicity, with clear patterns showing qualified Latino students being moved to rejection piles, while less qualified white students advanced. The document was titled Cultural Fit Analysis, a euphemism that would make any civil rights attorney's heart race. Maria photographed everything with professional precision, ensuring each image was clear, dated, and legally admissible. Her Harvard law training guided every decision. She knew exactly what evidence federal investigators would need and how to present it in a way that would withstand legal scrutiny. When she finished documenting the physical evidence, Maria looked at her watch, 6:47 a.m. Classes wouldn't begin for another hour, but she had one more crucial task. She walked to the law library's computer lab, where she uploaded all her evidence to an encrypted cloud drive, then composed a detailed legal brief analyzing the university's violations of federal civil rights law. The brief was masterful. 63 pages of legal analysis that read like it came from a top-tier civil rights firm. Because, in many ways, it did. Maria's legal skills hadn't atrophied during her 2 years of grief. They'd simply been waiting for the right case to demonstrate their power. There was nothing else to say. She quietly left the building as the first students began arriving for morning classes, carrying with her evidence that would shake the university to its foundation. At 8:15 a.m., Elena Rodriguez's law firm received a comprehensive package via encrypted email, recordings, photographs, statistical analysis, and a legal brief that laid out a compelling case for systematic discrimination. By 9:30 a.m., Elena had forwarded the package to the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, and 3 major civil rights organizations. By 10:45 a.m., federal investigators were scheduling emergency meetings. The evidence was so comprehensive, so well-organized, so legally sophisticated, that it immediately triggered a priority investigation. Within hours, news of the investigation had leaked to local media. This could be the most significant civil rights case in higher education this decade, said Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a civil rights expert interviewed by Channel 7 News. The evidence appears to document systematic exclusion of Latino students over multiple years. If proven, it would represent a fundamental violation of federal law. The university's communications department went into crisis mode, but their carefully crafted public statements couldn't hide the devastating nature of the allegations. Student protesters gathered on the quad, demanding transparency and justice. Latino community leaders called for Dean Patterson's resignation. Alumni donors began questioning their continued support. On social media, the hashtag #JaiWestfieldDiscrimination began trending as students shared their own stories of bias and exclusion. The local Spanish-language television station ran a special investigation, interviewing rejected Latino applicants whose qualifications clearly exceeded those of admitted white students. Within 48 hours, the story had gone viral. National civil rights organizations issued statements calling for a complete federal investigation. Major newspapers picked up the story, with headlines like Ivy-covered discrimination, elite law school accused of systematic bias, and the custodian who exposed higher education's dirty secret. But perhaps most importantly, current and former students began coming forward with their own experiences of discrimination. What had started as one woman's quiet documentation of injustice had become a movement that exposed decades of institutional bias. Maria watched the coverage from her apartment, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She'd accomplished what she'd set out to do: expose the discrimination that had denied opportunities to countless Latino students. But she also knew that her life was about to change dramatically, and there would be no going back to the anonymous. existence she'd created after her mother's death. Her phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Federal investigators want to meet with you tomorrow. Maria, what you've done is going to change everything. Are you ready?" Maria looked at her mother's photograph on the mantelpiece, then at her Harvard Law diploma hanging beside it. For the first time in 2 years, both seemed to belong in the same room, part of the same story. "See, Mommy," she whispered. "I'm ready." Federal investigators pulled Maria's employment records the next morning, and there she was, Maria Elena Rodriguez, Harvard Law School class of 2019, former associate at Morrison, Klein & Associates, specializing in federal civil rights law. The woman who had been emptying their trash cans for 18 months was one of the most qualified civil rights attorneys in the Southwest. "That's the custodial worker," whispered Professor Williams when investigators showed him Maria's photograph. Alongside her professional credentials, his face had gone pale as he realized the implications of every dismissive comment, every condescending interaction, every secret conversation she'd overheard while cleaning their offices. Dean Patterson stared at the documents spread across the conference table in stunned silence. Maria's law school transcript showed she'd graduated magna cum laude. Her professional record included 3 major civil rights victories, including a case against a university admissions system remarkably similar to Westfield's. The investigators had requested this meeting not as a preliminary inquiry, but as a formal confrontation with concrete evidence of systematic discrimination. "You want to understand how we built such a comprehensive case so quickly?" Lead investigator Janet Chen placed Maria's legal brief on the table. "Your own admissions committee has been under investigation by one of the most skilled civil rights attorneys in the country. She just happened to be wearing a janitor's uniform while she gathered evidence." The room fell silent as the full scope of their situation became clear. They hadn't just been caught discriminating. They'd been outmaneuvered by someone they'd consistently underestimated and dismissed. Later that afternoon, Maria sat across from Dean Patterson, Professor Williams, and 3 other senior faculty members. The university's legal team flanked them nervously, clearly aware that their institution faced potential federal sanctions that could cost millions in funding. On the table between them lay Maria's Harvard Law diploma, her bar admission certificate, and her case file from the investigation. "You want to know who I am?" she said, her voice steady and professional, stripped of the deference they were used to hearing from her. "So, I'll tell you." Maria opened her case file, revealing photographs, recordings, and documented evidence spanning 18 months. "I'm Maria Elena Rodriguez, Harvard Law School, class of 2019. I spent 3 years at Morrison, Klein & Associates building civil rights cases exactly like this one. I've argued before federal judges, negotiated with the Department of Justice, and won settlements that changed discriminatory practices at institutions across the country." Dean Patterson shifted uncomfortably. "If you're an attorney, why were you working as custodial staff?" "Because 2 years ago, my mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and I left my career to care for the woman who sacrificed everything to give me the education you've been systematically denying to other Latino students." Maria's voice carried the weight of personal loss and professional authority. "Isabel Rodriguez cleaned office buildings for 30 years to send me to college. She died believing that her sacrifice had meaning, that her daughter would use her education to fight for justice." Professor Williams, who had made countless dismissive comments about Maria's intelligence, sat speechless as she continued. "I didn't plan to investigate Westfield University. I took this job because I needed health insurance and anonymity while I processed my grief. But when I started hearing your conversations about cultural fit and maintaining standards, when I saw qualified Latino students being rejected while less qualified white students were admitted, when I witnessed the same discriminatory patterns I'd fought against in federal court, I couldn't stay silent." Maria spread out statistical analyses, showing clear patterns of discrimination. "You rejected 87% of Latino applicants over the past 5 years, compared to 34% of white applicants with similar qualifications. You used coded language in admissions committee meetings that explicitly discussed limiting Latino enrollment. You created additional barriers holistic reviews, and character assessments that were applied disproportionately to minority applicants. The university's lead attorney, Sarah Thompson, leaned forward. "Ms. Rodriguez, these are serious allegations. Do you have documentation to support these claims?" Maria smiled for the first time during the meeting. "I have 18 months of recorded conversations, photographed internal documents, statistical analysis that would hold up in federal court, and a legal brief that 3 Department of Justice attorneys have already reviewed. What I don't have is patience for institutions that perpetuate the same discrimination my mother faced her entire working life." "I didn't leave civil rights law," Maria continued, looking directly at each person around the table. "Civil rights law never left me. I just had to walk away temporarily for love. But love also brought me back. Love for students who deserve the same opportunities I received. Love for a community that refuses to be invisible anymore." In that quiet conference room, they finally saw Maria Rodriguez, not as a custodial worker whose opinions didn't matter, but as a Harvard-trained civil rights attorney who had spent 18 months building an airtight case against their institution. The woman they'd dismissed as invisible had been the most dangerous person in the building. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Dean Patterson finally spoke. "What do you want?" Maria's answer was immediate: justice, transparency, and systematic change that ensures this never happens again. The next morning, Maria stepped into the Westfield University Law School like always, but everything was different. Word of her identity had spread through the campus overnight. Social media posts, news articles, and whispered conversations had transformed her from an invisible custodial worker into the civil rights attorney who had exposed decades of discrimination. Chapter's main hallway, usually filled with rushing students and faculty absorbed in their own importance, fell silent as she approached. Then, slowly, a wave of applause began. It started with a small group of Latino students who had gathered near the bulletin board, grew to include other minority students, and eventually encompassed nearly everyone in the corridor. "Thank you," said a young woman with tears in her eyes, stepping forward from the crowd. "My brother applied here 3 times. He had better grades than half the students who got accepted, but they kept rejecting him. Now we know why." Similar stories emerged throughout the day. Students, staff, and community members approached Maria to share their experiences of discrimination, their families' stories of rejection despite strong qualifications, their gratitude that someone had finally exposed what they'd long suspected but couldn't prove. Later that week, the university announced major changes to their admissions process. A new diversity and inclusion committee would be created, with Maria Rodriguez serving as an external advisor. Federal monitors would oversee admissions for the next 5 years. A scholarship fund would be established specifically for Latino students, funded by the university's own endowment. Under pressure from federal investigators, alumni donors, and mounting public scrutiny, Dean Patterson announced his resignation. Professor Williams was placed on administrative leave, pending a full review of his role in the discriminatory practices. The entire admissions committee would undergo mandatory civil rights training. But perhaps most significantly, the university offered Maria something unprecedented: a full professorship in their civil rights law program, with tenure track and complete academic freedom to teach and research discrimination in higher education. She was invited to address the entire law school community at a special assembly. Under one condition: she would speak as Professor Rodriguez, not as the custodial worker they had ignored for 18 months. The auditorium was packed beyond capacity, with overflow seating in adjacent classrooms connected by video link. Students, faculty, administrators, community leaders, and national media representatives filled every available space. The woman who had been invisible for 18 months now commanded the attention of everyone who mattered in legal education. Maria stepped up to the podium and looked out at the sea of faces, some guilty, some grateful, some curious about the custodian-turned-professor who had exposed their institution's darkest secrets. 18 months ago, I walked into this building believing I was invisible, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium. You looked through me, spoke around me, dismissed me as irrelevant to your important conversations about law and justice. But invisible doesn't mean powerless, and silence doesn't mean absence. She paused, letting the words settle over an audience that had learned the hard way about underestimating people based on their appearance or position. My mother, Isabel Rodriguez, cleaned offices for 30 years. She was invisible to the people, whose trash she emptied, whose floors she mopped, whose secrets she overheard. But she saw everything. She understood that dignity isn't determined by your job title, that intelligence isn't measured by your paycheck, and that justice doesn't care whether you wear a janitor's uniform or a judicial robe when you serve it. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. For too long, this institution has operated on the assumption that some people matter more than others, that some voices deserve to be heard, while others can be safely ignored, that some dreams are worth pursuing, while others can be dismissed without consequence. Today, that assumption died. Maria gestured toward the audience, her eyes finding the Latino students who had gathered in the front rows. To the students who were rejected, not because you lacked qualifications, but because this institution lacked courage, your time is coming. To the families who sacrificed everything for educational opportunities that were stolen by prejudice, justice delayed is not justice denied. To the community that has been told your voices don't matter, they were wrong. She lifted her head higher, her voice growing stronger. Excellence isn't threatened by diversity, it's enhanced by it. Intelligence doesn't diminish when it speaks with an accent. Leadership doesn't weaken when it comes from unexpected places. This institution will be stronger, more just, and more excellent when it finally looks like the community it claims to. Serve! The entire auditorium erupted in thunderous applause that continued for several minutes. Students stood, faculty stood, even some of the administrators who had dismissed her joined the ovation. But Maria's eyes found the Latino students in the front rows, many of them crying, all of them on their feet. "Professor Rodriguez," a student called out during the applause, "what's your first lesson going to be?" Maria smiled, remembering her mother's words about being invisible but never blind. That justice wears many different uniforms, speaks many different languages, and comes from the places you least expect. And that sometimes the most important legal education happens outside the classroom, in the moments when we choose to see people others have made invisible. 6 months later, Professor Maria Rodriguez stood in her new office in the Westfield University Law School, looking out at the campus where she had once pushed a custodial cart through corridors of indifference. The nameplate on her door read, "Professor Maria E. Rodriguez, Civil Rights Law." But she kept a small photograph on her desk, her mother, Isabel, in her custodial uniform, smiling with quiet dignity. The changes at Westfield had been dramatic. The incoming class included 47 Latino students, more than the previous 5 years combined. The university had implemented comprehensive bias training for all faculty and staff. Most importantly, they had established the Isabel Rodriguez Memorial Scholarship, providing full tuition support for first-generation college students from immigrant families. Maria's civil rights law course had become the most popular elective in the law school, with a waiting list that stretched 2 semesters. But she hadn't forgotten where she'd learned her most important lessons about justice. Once a month, she volunteered with the custodial staff, helping them understand their rights and encouraging those with educational aspirations to pursue their dreams. "Professor Rodriguez," called out Jamie, one of the young custodial workers, "there's someone here to see you." A nervous young woman stood in the doorway, clutching an acceptance letter from Westfield Law School. "Professor Rodriguez, I'm Carolina Morales. I was one of the students who was rejected 3 times before. They called yesterday. I got in." Maria's eyes filled with tears as she embraced the young woman. "Your mother must be so proud." "She is," Carolina said, wiping her own tears. "She cleans houses, like your mother cleaned offices. She always said education was the one thing nobody could take away from us." She was right. Standing there with Carolina, surrounded by the law books and diplomas that represented opportunity and justice, Maria could almost hear her mother's voice. "Mija, this is why we sacrificed. This is why it all mattered." The story of Maria Rodriguez spread far beyond Westfield University. Other institutions began examining their own practices. Federal investigations were launched at universities across the country, and a new generation of civil rights attorneys drew inspiration from the custodian who had never stopped being a lawyer. Because sometimes the most powerful voice for change comes from the most unexpected place. Sometimes justice wears a janitor's uniform and speaks with an immigrant's accent. And sometimes the person you overlook is the very person who will hold you accountable for your actions. Maria had learned that being invisible doesn't mean being powerless. It just means you're watching, listening, and waiting for the right moment to remind the world that everyone's voice matters, everyone's dreams deserve respect, and everyone's fight for justice deserves to be heard.